We will now move to a topic that is close to home for us here at NYU. New York City was the first city in the world to align its sustainability goals with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, with climate action featured front and center. Our next panel, Decarbonizing NYC's Built Environment, will discuss the opportunities and challenges of decarbonizing our real estate. I'm pleased to introduce Marianna Koval, Director of the Invest NYC SDG Initiative at NYU Stern CSB, and panelists Jessica Bailey, President and CEO of Nuveen Capital, John Mandyck, Chief Executive Officer of Urban Green Council, Tyng Patka, Partner at Duval Stachenfeld LLP, and Curtis Probst, Chief Executive Officer of NYCEEC. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. So I'm really excited to be here and have this wonderful panel of experts. I wanted to be very clear that as we talk about decarbonizing New York City's built environment, our focus is on the Climate Mobilization Act, which importantly includes the stick of Local Law 97 and the carrot of PACE, Property Assessed Clean Energy Financing. So there are many steps being undertaken by many organizations and people to decarbonize New York City. But this discussion's intended to focus on the Climate Mobilization Act. And just as a little bit of housekeeping, if you have any questions for the panelists, please put them in the chat. If we have time, and we only have 45 minutes today for this conversation, we'll try to answer them, but we will otherwise try to respond in writing after the panel discussion. So could everybody turn their cameras on? Great. So we have the full bios and contact information in your practice forum materials, but we have a great panel of experts today. Curtis Probst, CEO of NYCEEC, the New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation, which has been described as the first local green bank in the United States. They provide loans for energy efficiency and clean energy projects. And most importantly for this conversation, they're the PACE administrator for New York City. We also are joined by John Mandyck, the CEO of the Urban Green Council, which is a research, education, and advocacy organization committed to transforming buildings in New York City for a more sustainable future. And we're joined by Tyng Patka, a partner at Duval Stachenfeld, a top real estate law firm in New York City. She's perhaps the leading legal expert in this city on all matters relating to Local Law 97 and PACE. And finally, we're joined by Jessica Bailey, the president and CEO of Nuveen Capital, a major PACE originator, the first PACE originator to close a CPACE loan in New York City at 111 Wall Street. And Jessica also notably led the implementation of the first successful CPACE program at the Connecticut Green Bank. So I thought, just to provide a little context, since we have people from outside New York, people from outside New York State that have joined us in this conversation, I thought I'd first ask John to step up and set the context here. We know the Climate Mobilization Act is one of the most ambitious, forward-looking pieces of climate legislation enacted by any city in the U.S. as it works to limit building emissions. You worked closely, John, in the negotiation of this Climate Mobilization Act. Can you give us a little bit of context about the law?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I'm thrilled to join my fellow panelists, and thank you, Marianna. Congratulations to you and your colleagues at NYU for this really terrific event. You know, this law, it's called Local Law 97 in New York City in our local lingo. But what it is in reality is it's a law that will deliver the largest carbon reduction of any city in the world by placing carbon caps on buildings starting in 2024 and then ratcheting down again in 2030. So we're really proud of this law and its pace-setting role for buildings and decarbonization around the world. From our vantage point, the framework is pretty well set. But there's still a lot of work ahead in the implementing regulations as we approach the first compliance date of 2024. One of those is a pretty technical detail, but very, very important to the law, which is how do we translate energy into carbon for the 2030 compliance date? That's known as the carbon coefficient. Buildings for electricity use energy. They don't emit carbon directly. That emission happens sometimes 100 miles away at a power plant. Yet buildings in New York are responsible now for those emissions. And so there has to be a forecast of sorts for how the grid will look in 2030, the renewable mix, the efficiency of those power plants to convert that energy into carbon. So that's one of the many regulations that are due by the end of this year. And we're working hard with the Department of Buildings to help define those to make this law as practical and implementable as it can be. Maybe the last comment I'll make, just as an opening framing, is the direction for building decarbonization only grows stronger in New York City. We had another big development in December with the passage of what we know as Local Law 154, which phases out fossil fuels in new buildings starting in 2024. We are the largest city again in the world to take this step to phase out fossil fuels in new construction. And that begins in 2024. So a lot of good work. The policy pace, sorry for keep using that word as a pun, but the policy pace keeps moving faster when it comes to building decarbonization. And we're happy to play the role that we do at Urban Green to guide that.
So thank you, John, for just sort of providing this context. I wanted just to turn to Curtis for a minute. And Curtis, you've reminded me not to conflate Local Law 97 and PACE, and that decarbonization of New York City is taking place without PACE. Could you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that, and speak to our audience today specifically about the PACE program, which you're the administrator of?
Sure. So there are about 1 million buildings in New York City, and many of them are not subject to Local Law 97 because they don't achieve the size threshold, or they're subject to an exception because of affordable housing and those sorts of things. So you're talking about a smaller subset of buildings within the city. As John mentioned, the first compliance year is 2024. Only about 20% of the buildings, and obviously that's going to vary depending on their characteristics over the next couple of years and how they operate, but only a small portion, about 20% of the buildings, are likely to be subject to Local Law 97 penalties in that first test year. So it's a relatively small number. So when you talk about Local Law 97, it's a very important law. It's a great law in terms of trying to achieve the city's climate objectives, but it's not impacting all of the buildings. And for the buildings that are being impacted by Local Law 97, they have many means of financing necessary energy efficiency improvements. That could be through operating cash flow, through direct loans, through equipment leases, through ESAs, through power purchase agreements, lots of means. But PACE is an important tool within that. Then at the same time, go over to the PACE side of the ledger. If you look at PACE, there are a lot of PACE loans happening for buildings, or nationally, for buildings that aren't subject to something like Local Law 97. And there are many buildings that won't be facing penalties, but are looking for deeper decarbonization. And PACE is a great product, and I'm sure Jessica will talk at greater length about the importance of PACE, but it's a great product to allow for that deeper decarbonization, whether or not Local Law 97 penalties would be in place.
So let's turn then to Jessica. Jessica, so you at Greenworks closed the very first CPACE loan in New York City. Tell us about that experience, that building 111 wall, and what your experience is to date, and what the pipeline looks like.
Sure. Just point of clarification, we actually closed the second loan in New York City, and it was 730 3rd Avenue. 111 Wall was done by another originator, but there's only been two. So we did one of them. The transaction.
My apologies.
No, not at all. Not at all. And my company, which was known as Greenworks Lending until about a year ago when we were acquired by Nuveen, is now known as Nuveen Capital. And we lend all over the country and are excited about continuing to build our footprint in New York City. The first transaction we did in New York City was an office building that was going through a kind of major gut renovation, everything from the windows to the equipment in the basement to building management systems. So sort of a classic old, somewhat traditional New York City office building on 3rd Avenue. The owner there made the decision that they wanted to use PACE for a couple of reasons, but the primary one was that structurally it is an assessment-based finance that allows for the tenants to both get the benefit of the improved building, but also pay for their pro rata share of the assessment through a surcharge on their lease structure. So it's a type of financing that a lot of tenant occupied buildings are attracted to. We are seeing a ton of demand in New York City. If I'm being honest, it's waning a bit because of the delays in the relaunch of the program. So the guidelines to allow for PACE to be used on more buildings in New York City are currently being rewritten and re-reviewed. So we're in a bit of a holding pattern here. But in terms of the types of owners that are looking to use PACE, it's really across the board. So, we're seeing a lot of interest from the hotel sector. The hospitality sector obviously hit hard by COVID. A lot of hotel owners are looking for creative ways to finance. New York City in particular, obviously, was such a tourism hub there, and the recent decision by the city council not to allow for new development of hotels. You've got a lot of hotel owners who are trying to make renovations there. We actually see a lot of demand for green roof financing, which is not currently something that CPACE is contemplated to be able to finance. But we've got a lot of roof space. We love green roofs, so I think it's a really cool way to think about CPACE. Helping to decarbonize and reduce the energy consumption of buildings. And obviously having a rooftop garden on your building is a nice to have anyway. We see a lot of requests for office renovation. So the kind of return to work move right now is prompting a lot of building owners and companies to think about what type of office they need for a changed workforce, most of which are not back in an office 5 days a week, are looking for more convening space and perhaps less private office space. We see a lot of interest in windows. So there's a couple of really cool companies that are doing really interesting things with windows that can have a meaningful impact on the kind of energy consumption of a building. And then new construction. So this is an application of CPACE that we have seen grow like gangbusters across the country where we lend, but really using CPACE in a capital stack for a new development project that really allows an owner to not have to kind of value engineer all of the sustainable measures that might be upfront a bit more costly than something less energy efficient. But being able to integrate PACE allows them to make a kind of a smart long-term decision, even as it's helping the cash flow or, perhaps hurting the cash flow initially. So new construction for us is something that has been a big piece of our business around the country. We're hoping once the guidelines from New York City are re-released, we'll be able to provide some financing there as well.
Well, thanks, Jessica. I want to return to the new construction focus and the movement as gangbusters later in the conversation. But Tyng, so in your practice, talk to us a little bit about your borrower roster and your clients, their thoughts and your guidance of your clients on both Local Law 97 and PACE.
Thanks, Marianna, and thank you to NYU for having me today. My roster of borrowers is typically owners and developers, particularly developers. But I'll start with owners first. So owners are finally in New York City waking up to Local Law 97. I have been getting an increase in interest and questions, and I would say the last 6 to 9 months about Local Law 97 compliance. And in those discussions, the number one question is always how am I going to pay for this? And to which my answer is, well, City Council already anticipated your question, and PACE is a good answer to how to pay for retrofitting your building. But it's really the developers that I represent, because I represent developers in New York City developers in obtaining property tax incentives to build. And when I have discussions with developers, they are always excited to hear about another alternative way to financing, because trying to fill up their capital stack is one of their the biggest headaches and hurdles in launching a project. And as Jessica mentioned before, PACE is very effective at lowering the cost of a developer's capital stack. The issue in the city right now is simply publicity and familiarity with the PACE program, because due to the slow launch of PACE, in part due to the pandemic, the development community in New York City, they're still wrapping their heads around PACE, learning exactly what it is and how they can fit it into their capital stack. So these are the types of conversations I'm having with my clients on a regular basis.
So just picking up on that, a question about PACE as part of the new construction capital stack. Curtis, at NYCEEC, what does your pipeline look like? I mean, I know right now that you've had to pause as some of the regulations are being redrafted, and yet you have your finger on the pulse of this. If Local Law 97 is intended to help decarbonize our existing buildings, how is there enough capital so that we can focus on new construction? How do we encourage PACE originators to focus on the existing multifamily buildings that are really a critical piece of New York's carbon picture?
Yeah, a lot of questions to unpack there. I guess in terms of a couple of things as far as NYCEEC. So, we have a couple of roles. One is we are ourselves a lender to energy efficiency measures through direct loans, equipment loans, et cetera, things outside of the PACE world. And we continue to see active interest in all those segments of the market. So regardless of Local Law 97 timelines or we do a lot of work in the affordable housing arena where there are prescriptive measures, there are not Local Law 97 penalties. We continue to see a lot of activity around energy efficiency. And that spans from some of the things Jessica mentioned, whether that's windows and, shell improvements to, building monitoring systems and storage. So it's really across the gamut. In terms of PACE administration, so a different thing, and that's where we look to really lenders like Jessica's organization to provide capital. I think there is plenty of capital both for existing buildings and for new construction. I think the challenge is that it just takes time to put these programs together, and I know that everybody would like the program to move at a more accelerated pace. But this is a public-private partnership. It is private capital that is using a public sector mechanism, namely the property tax authority of the city of New York. And those public-private partnerships take time, whether it's PACE or whether it's another form of partnership. I'd say the other thing is that the New York City program is fairly complicated because it has to fit within the New York state laws. And it has to fit within New York state regulation, which is largely overseen by NYSERDA. And then it has to fit within New York City laws and New York City regulations. And then you also have to add in the layer that you have some things in the city, for example, tax lien securitization, where some of the property taxes are already being financed. So it's a somewhat more complicated framework, which explains a lot of the delays in addition to COVID, which Tyng mentioned, which certainly hasn't helped matters. But I'm confident that once the program is up and running and relaunched, that we will have a lot of capital. We already have 11 qualified lenders, and they are excited to participate both in new construction and in existing buildings.
Boy, so John, why don't you give us a perspective from Urban Green Council on your education and advocacy role? What can we do better with the PACE program? How do we reach more building owners and property developers?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's off to a good start. As Jessica mentioned, there's a pipeline and people are starting to be aware. I know there's, a couple little growing pains to work out in the program itself, and that's to be expected with a new program. But I think once once it's open for business, I think you're going to see a line of people starting to do more deals, which is great. I think the area that we really need to focus on is on multifamily housing. Local Law 97, as Curtis rightly pointed out, doesn't cover every building, right? We have 1 million buildings in New York City. Local Law 97 covers those 25,000 square feet and above, which is about half of the square footage, though, of the area of the city. So it's about half. And then within Local Law 97, about 60% of that is multifamily. Mm-hmm. So that's a big area we need to focus on. And we've been talking about the effects of the pandemic. We have to understand that multifamily just isn't multifamily anymore. It's really mixed use, right? Because people are working from home. Mm-hmm. And we're starting to get a first cut of that. We're about to release in a few weeks our analysis of the 2020 benchmarking data. In New York City, we have a law that requires city big buildings, these buildings, to report their energy and water use. Our early indications are showing something very, very interesting to this effect, that electricity was down 15% in office buildings in 2020, but just down 2.5% in multifamily buildings. And that's skewed significantly by Manhattan. So Manhattan residential and multifamily was down 7% during the pandemic in 2020. Every other borough was up, though. With some about 4%, one borough was up 10% in electrical use in multifamily. So that's a new reality and just complicates matters, but speaks to the fact that we need to reach that sector more. That's a priority. It's a more difficult sector to reach than the commercial sector, which is more aggregated. But that's, I think, where a lot of focus needs to move.
And as we think about how to focus on that sector, I'm interested, Jessica, Nuveen has a deep equity commitments and big real estate investments, particularly in low to moderate income housing in New York. What are your thoughts about how we reach multifamily, and particularly multifamily in low to moderate income communities?
Yeah, currently multifamily is the largest asset type that we are financing, which is perhaps not surprising because of all of the new development happening around multifamily. So I completely agree with John that I think that is where the market needs to move and ought to move, and we're seeing it move there currently. I think there are all sorts of reasons that PACE is a really attractive way to finance upgrades in existing multifamily and a way to reduce the cost of financing for sustainable new construction around multifamily. So I just second the idea that the 421A multifamily is sort of where we've seen a lot of demand come in New York City. And I think once the program turns on, hopefully soon in the next couple of weeks, months, we'll be able to provide a financing solution that'll make it a really smart business decision for these buildings to move forward.
And just, Curtis, not to put you on the spot, but any indication of when the program will be back up and ready to close more loans?
Hopefully very soon. We're the administrator for the program, so we don't set policy or regulation. We're working closely with the city and with the state, for that matter. As I said, we have two levels of government that we work with on this program. So. Mm-hmm. Very soon. I know that everybody's excited about it. We continue to get a lot of inquiry, and I know that there are a lot of organizations like Jessica's who have been doing a great job in trying to develop the product. So stay tuned.
So one barrier, at least in the past, to PACE is that it requires the underlying mortgage holder's consent. What's your sense? I'll put this question to Tyng first, of bank awareness and kind of openness to PACE. And what kind of steps could the city and other mortgage lenders take?
Banks are certainly becoming increasingly aware of PACE. PACE has been around for several years nationwide. Even though it's relatively new in New York City, it's not a relatively new program in and of itself. But once it hits New York City, it'll certainly, blast open the market. We believe. The discussions I've been having with senior lenders is, number one, they're curious about PACE. They want to know they also want to wrap their heads around what the program is and how does it affect their rights. But also there's a laissez-faire attitude with we're the senior lender. Why do we need to give up our rights to first priority? And to which my response to these lenders is, first mover market advantage. If a borrower is really intent on seeking PACE, and PACE is a very valuable portion of the capital stack, if you as a lender are inflexible about allowing PACE to go ahead of you, then this borrower will probably be forced to find someone else, and the senior lender will then lose that loan. So the hurdle of obtaining senior consent certainly still exists, but I'm very optimistic that as like I said earlier, publicity and familiarity increase with the program, hopefully that hurdle decreases and eventually goes away.
And Jessica, what's your sense of the barrier that lender consent creates for PACE?
Yeah, I think Tyng did a great job sort of reflecting what we see in the market as well. I will say, having been doing this for nearly 10 years now, it's gotten a lot easier. And in part, that's due to normalization and education. There was a long period of time where the conventional wisdom was that PACE sits ahead of a senior lender. And in fact, it doesn't. It is just the current amount due on the property tax bill to service the PACE assessment that sits ahead of them. And so really what we're talking about is a bank, a mortgage lender needing to re-underwrite a property with a kind of increased debt service load, right? They've got to service this PACE assessment with higher property taxes. But that's a structure that banks are used to seeing. So as long as the borrower and the PACE lender are not endeavoring to over-lever a property or put too much PACE onto a property that they can't handle with the cash flow from the building, we see lenders figuring out a way to get comfortable with it. It's, PACE is really passive, long-dated capital that can never be accelerated. So when we're looking at a building that's being improved, when we're looking at a building that in theory ought to have their cash flow helped by this because we're dropping the utility bill, right? We're reducing the energy consumption of that building. We're really helping to create a better asset for that mortgage lender. And most of the smart banks and smart debt funds and smart lenders have figured out a way to underwrite this into their review process, provide consent where it makes sense, and be a part of these programs. So I think there's something like 200 or 300 different banks, many of which are based in New York City, even though they haven't been consenting in New York City, that are comfortable with PACE, understand how it works, understand where it doesn't work. I'm always the first to say PACE is not the right financial solution for every property type and every property. I think to the extent we're going to senior lenders with projects that pencil out, that make sense, we're getting consent routinely.
And John, Urban Green Council, what has been your perspective on the process of education of underlying mortgage lenders and acceptance of PACE?
It's not an area that we touch as directly as everybody else on this panel. I can say, I think we're going to get into it in a little bit in the discussion. I think the pending SEC rules are going to be a nice entree to talk about why banks should be concerned about looking at energy efficiency in their lending practices, not just for buildings, by the way. I think this has the ability to really be transformative across the entire economy. So I'm excited about that. So we haven't reached that audience yet, but I think there are increasingly will be more avenues to do that.
I know, at NYU Stern, the Center for Sustainable Business, we're very interested in developing or flipping the script. I mean, most of the focus so far on PACE has been on building owners. And it's been interesting to us as we begin to look at the portfolios of buildings that different mortgage lenders hold in New York City, that with the new SEC climate disclosure rule, which still is in its comment period, but increasingly investors want to understand the Scope 3 emissions, the emissions in a bank's investment portfolio, and that would be these mortgages, that gives us a very interesting opportunity to leverage a bank's interest in reducing their Scope 3 carbon emissions. Tyng, what do you think about that kind of flipping the script approach?
Well, I think I think you're right. That with increasing requirements of disclosures and increasing shareholder demand of seeing a company's ESG initiatives, I think PACE fills that need. PACE has the ability to quantify for a corporation how much ESG, how much sustainability they are partaking in.
It can be a positive brand to be invested in buildings that have PACE loans.
Yes, absolutely. Putting it bluntly, PACE allows the corporation to check a box.
And Curtis, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the SEC action will be helpful. To me, I think the bigger driver, though, continues to be the economic opportunity. I think that once you start to see more PACE volumes, then both existing PACE lenders and mortgage holders who are getting consent requests will gain just greater awareness of the market and the opportunity. And then at that point, some of the people who are consenting to PACE loans may decide they want to become PACE lenders themselves. And you'll see this really start to take off. So to me, it's, those broader actions taking place are and they are supportive to the clean energy transition. But I think the economic opportunity will continue to be what, sort of drives people and will help this really gain momentum in terms of decarbonizing the city.
So you say that with the 11 qualified PACE lenders in New York City, are any of those 11 qualified PACE lenders also major mortgage lenders currently in New York?
Yeah, the majority of the existing lenders are specialty PACE lenders, so their business is making PACE loans. Some of them have affiliations with, sister companies, parent companies that are more involved in mortgage lending and other parts of the fixed income markets. But we're starting to see more inquiry from, other types of lenders. And I think, as with most financing markets, we're still at a very early stage. Remember, on New York City CPACE, we're in the pilot phase. Mm-hmm. But as this becomes a more mature market, this will start to look like other more mature financing markets, and you'll start to see a much broader, more diverse range of lenders, and actually a more diverse range of borrowers as well. I think you'll see CDFIs playing a role in this market. I think you'll see the large multi-line banks, universal banks playing a role, community banks. So it's, we're still in the early stages, but there is increasing interest, and I think that's part of the awareness and education efforts that many of the panelists have, spoken to.
I've been encouraging lenders that they should consider becoming PACE lenders themselves if they're genuinely concerned about another lender, either rightfully or wrongfully jumping ahead of their mortgage. Then the way to hedge that is to do it yourself.
Marianna, can I jump back into the SEC conversation?
Yeah, definitely. John, step in.
Yeah. So, this is really big, and people are just starting to unpack it. But maybe just for the purposes of our audience, the EPA defines greenhouse gas emissions in 3 scopes. Scope 1 is, and let's take a traditional manufacturer. So scope 1 would be the fossil fuels burned at a factory to create a product. Scope 2 would be the electricity bought from a power plant and the emissions that happen there. Scope 3 would be your supply chain carbon impacts for the products you are about to make, and then the impact of your product in use in the field. When you place that in the context of a bank, it becomes super interesting and economy-wide, because the scope 1 emissions of a bank will be, for example, if there's a boiler in the basement of a bank building that's burning natural gas, so that's a carbon emission. Scope 2 will be the electricity that they buy from Con Ed or anybody else in a service territory. And that's where the conversation is kind of stopped. Mm-hmm. Scope 3 for a bank is their product. Their product is their lending and the carbon emissions that are created by their lending. This is a game changer.
Right.
And what the SEC in the United States is suggesting and proposing is that all publicly traded companies have to disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So if banks have to start disclosing their scope 3 emissions, that means they need to start calculating the carbon emission impact of their lending. And that is huge. And so I think there's a huge opportunity here, not only for buildings, but economy-wide, to start to tackle how capital is flowing through the marketplace and the carbon emissions associated with it.
Thank you, John.
Sorry, just to jump on that, John, I couldn't agree more. I think it was sort of like the biggest news that not that many people knew about this week, the SEC guidance that came out. Obviously, it's not finalized yet, but we work alongside hundreds of banks, right? And Nuveen itself has a large mortgage lending business, a large asset management business, owns a lot of real estate itself. Nuveen's made bold commitments, right? We have made a commitment to carbon neutrality. We have made huge strides towards that. And I would say Nuveen is ahead of many of its competitors on this front. That said, there are a whole bunch of banks, asset managers, real estate owners that have made commitments that they don't know how to fulfill. And I think this year we're really starting to see the commitments having been made the last 3 years turn into, okay, so now what, where are you on this? It does feel a little bit like a sea change in the last 6 months, where the kind of, the glossy report that says what you're going to do is no longer enough to keep people happy and keep people feel like we're moving in the right direction. And we really need to match those commitments with action. I think, PACE is obviously one of the tools that will help real estate owners decarbonize, but also mortgage lenders that we lend alongside. We say all the time, they are a part of the story of this PACE loan going on the building, because they have to consent and they ought to take credit for that building's decarbonization, because without their consent and approval, the PACE wouldn't happen. So even though it isn't their money, it is their asset that they own. And so I think we're going to see a lot more of kind of partnership among PACE lenders and banks thinking about, how do we both try to move towards decarbonization of the built environment.
And it's been very interesting conversations in talking about what the impact of the SEC rule may be if it becomes law. But even if there's litigation and it's delayed, increasingly investors are insisting on Scope 3 emission disclosures. So this is going to be something that needs to be contemplated. And what when I have conversations with key people, all it takes is one bank in New York, one bank to take a leadership role and to go and have a program to work with all of its mortgage borrowers, whether they're subject to local law 97 or not, but one bank to create a unit in the bank to work to actively encourage decarbonization and clean energy projects, and claim that credit in your carbon reporting, tout that. But be a leader right now in New York City, and I don't know. I feel very optimistic about the possibility of finding that one bank to provide that leadership. What do you think, John? Am I foolish?
I share your optimism. I mean, interestingly, some of the big banks as investors themselves in other projects are looking to that type of disclosure in the climate risk, but it hasn't happened in the investment side, right? So literally, like, who's watching the banks who are doing the investing, and what is the climate risk of where their money is going? And so that's, I think, what's new here. And I agree with you. I think, we will see banks who are progressive on this and understand, and will start to realize the power of putting their capital to good.
Well, so I just got a question. If banks are required to report carbon emissions of their loans and their portfolio isn't capable of aggregating those emissions, aren't we in danger of garbage in, garbage out reporting?
Yeah, but that's That's true. It's not just banks. That's true of anybody for climate change. I mean, what we're really starting to see is a refinement of the data and the data collection tools. And there's a whole new industry to do that that's out there that's helping companies quantify and qualify their scope 3 emissions, because it's hard. It's very hard. It's as hard as it is for a bank. Imagine if you're a large manufacturer and you literally have 10,000 suppliers. You have to qualify and quantify those scope 3 emissions. And so we need to do it. The fact that it's hard shouldn't be the barrier for us to do it.
And in New York City, because of the kinds of publicly available disclosures that have already been made under Local Law 84, we're able to see, and any lender is able to see, for at least buildings over 25,000 square feet, what their energy use is, and using the coefficient, their carbon emissions. So that's knowable. Well, we're coming down to the last few minutes of our panel. And I guess, so New York City's led the country with this most ambitious of all climate change legislation. We have a goal of reducing carbon emissions 80% by 2050. It's taken a little bit of time to move forward and launch these key programs. What are your thoughts about how this is going to move forward? Are we going to be successful? Curtis, why don't you start?
I'm glad you gave me the easy question first. I think we will ultimately be successful, but what mix of policy, technology, and finance gets us to that end state? I think we're still in the very early days. So I am optimistic, and I think part of it is because it's not just about climate, it's about a lot of co-benefits. It's about investing in the building stock of New York City. It's about improving tenant comfort. It's about improving resilience and safety and security. There are so many reasons to do this beyond just greenhouse gas reductions, which is, of course, a hugely important goal. But I think we'll end up there. I don't think any of us know what twists and turns will happen over the next, many years to get us to that point.
Yeah. Tyng, well, what are your thoughts?
I'm slightly less optimistic in the short term. We didn't discuss Local Law 97's first compliance deadline, which is January 1 of 2024. And there are still a lot of building owners who are subject to Local Law 97 that are either still unfamiliar with the law or have not really begun preparing. And those that have begun preparing are worrying about how are they going to pay for these retrofits in order to comply. And is there enough time? It's no secret that New York City is very heavy with bureaucracy when it comes to construction. So my concern is whether or not these building owners are going to be able to meet the January 2024 deadline, particularly given that the PACE rollout has also been slow to launch.
Yeah. And Jessica, your thoughts?
Yeah, I probably would throw my lot in with Tyng on being a little less optimistic. I think, the delay on the launch of the PACE program in New York City has been, unsettling, right? I think that we had been under the impression that we'd be able to be making loans in New York to promote clean energy in buildings a year ago. I totally hear Curtis's point about the multiple levels of approvals needed and kind of eyeballs on this program. I, in a previous life, worked for the state of Connecticut designing the program. So I am very sympathetic to the public sector side of getting these programs up and running. But I'm also sort of a points on the board person where I do think there is an element of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we're not going to get everything that we want. There's going to be course corrections along the way. But to Tyng's point, these dates are coming up, and just having a program that is bankable, is lendable within, I think is important sooner than later if it's going to be if PACE is going to be a meaningful way that buildings decarbonize. So I'm hopeful we can get something out there so that we can start seeing some projects get financed, start normalizing this, and move forward.
That's great. Thanks, Jessica. John, I'm going to give you the last word, but brief last words.
Sure. I mean, I think about it this way. New York has $3 trillion of insured coastal properties. That's twice the GDP of Canada. So my question is, do we really have a choice? We have a lot at stake. I get that these are complicated and ambitious laws, but we have to keep the big picture in mind, which is the climate is not waiting for us to figure this out.
Yeah.
So we either figure it out or we face the consequences. And I'm optimistic that we have made so much progress in the last couple of years that we'll continue to do so.
Thanks. That was a great wrap up. And thank you very much, everyone, for taking this time and joining us. And thank you to all of our panelists. Have a great Friday and good luck.
Thank you, Marianna,
Thank you,
Jessica, John, Tyng, and Curtis. Our city is lucky to have you tackling our carbon footprint.